8 years ago, 2013, Republicans gained control of the whole government in North Carolina, and they immediately passed one of the most restrictive voting laws in the country. In response, the head of the North Carolina NAACP at the time, the Reverend Dr. William Barber, he started leading weekly protests outside the state capitol in North Carolina. They were called Moral Mondays, and they started small. But every week, these protests grew and grew. They turned out a remarkably broad coalition of people from all walks of life in North Carolina. They started making national news. Less than a year after the first Moral Monday protest, a moral march to the North Carolina state capitol drew tens of thousands of people. That was the largest civil rights rally in the South since the Selma March in 1965. The Moral Monday movement spread to other states. You can see its influence, among other places, in the social justice protests that swept the country last summer in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd. Now, this year, though, the state that is currently trying to pass the nation's most restrictive voting law is Texas. And as Democratic Texas state legislators continue to block the passage of that law by staying out of their home state, they've been remaining in D.C. to advocate for a national voting rights law. One of the most prominent voices leading the charge back home against the restrictive voting law in Texas has been Beto O'Rourke, the former Texas congressman and presidential candidate who has become a full-time voting rights advocate, barnstorming across the state of Texas last month, holding rallies in something like 20 different cities, trying to build momentum from Texas for a federal voting rights backstop that will stop Republicans from what they're doing in Texas and stop them from doing it across the country. Well, now, Congressman O'Rourke is teaming up with Moral Mondays founder William Barber. They are making a big announcement today about upping the game to try to get something done on voting rights and what is already being called a summer of direct action to support the right to vote. Joining us now are the Reverend Dr. William Barber. He's president of Repairers of the Breach and the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. Also, Beto O'Rourke, former Democratic congressman from Texas, the founder of Powered by People, a grassroots organization working to mobilize Texas voters. Gentlemen, I'm honored to have you both here tonight. I know you're in the middle of tons of organizing and tons of work. Thank you both for being here. Reverend Barber, I'd like to start with you. If you could just talk to us about what it is that you have planned, the announcement that you and Congressman O'Rourke have made today about what your next steps are.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel. And, you know, we won in North Carolina. We actually took that mobilization, took it into court, and we beat back the worst voter suppression bill since Jim Crow. We announced today that we're going to have, beginning in Georgetown, Texas, on July the 27th, ending in Austin, Texas, on July the 31st, a moral resurrection and a march from Georgetown to Austin, similar to the march from Selma to Montgomery. It is time to nationalize what's going on in Texas. And in this particular march from Georgetown to Austin, 27 miles, 4 days of marching, we're demanding four things. End the filibuster. Pass every provision of the For the People Act, which is actually the bill John Lewis wrote. Pass the Voting Rights Act restoration, and pass $15 an hour living wage, because we've got to connect voting to economics and recognize this is not just a black issue. It's not just Jim Crow. It's James Crow Esquire. We're going to walk with our feet, put legs on our prayers, nationalize this, and make a cry from Texas, people of all races, creeds, and color, because it's time. It's time. We have to demand these things, and we can't have a little piece here and a little piece there and all of this negotiation. We need four things to happen. And the fifth thing we're going to add to it is we must protect our immigrants, in particular those DACA students. And all of this is connected to the protection of voting rights.
Congressman O'Rourke, let me ask you about that basic idea of nationalizing the fight in Texas, as Reverend Barber just put it. You obviously have been straddling the different parts of your political power, your political base, as a national figure in the Democratic Party, as a Texan, somebody who's gone home to essentially barnstorm the state while Texas Democrats are in Washington trying to get federal help. Tell me about that idea of nationalizing the Texas fight.
Well, those Texas legislators in D.C. have already begun the important work of doing that, providing that moral pressure and leverage on the U.S. Senate and President Biden, for that matter, to pass the For the People Act. That is the last best hope for voting rights, not just in Texas, but Georgia and Florida and about a dozen other states that have passed voter suppression and voter intimidation measures. But because Texas is the toughest state in which to vote, and it's about to get a lot harder if these new voter suppression bills pass, these are the front lines in this battle. And it's why I'm so grateful that the Poor People's Campaign and Bishop Barber have made this the center of their attention, because he's absolutely right. Voting is not just connected to our democracy, as essential as that is. It's connected to the fact that Texas still has a $7.25 an hour minimum wage. It's connected to the fact that we're the least insured state in the country, where people still die of diabetes and the flu and curable cancers because they can't see a doctor. 7 million eligible Texans did not vote in the 2020 election, and it was not for lack of love of democracy. It's the voter suppression obstacles placed in their way. So Bishop Barber's effort here in Texas, the march that he's helping to organize, the people who will come out on the 31st, Saturday, at the Capitol in Austin, we're going to help the United States Congress and our president push through the For the People Act and get some democracy in Texas and throughout the rest of the country.
Reverend Barber, let me ask you about the big picture here in terms of tactics, in terms of moving people. Your history in North Carolina in particular, but also the national reach of what you did, what you started in North Carolina with you and the coalition that you built there, I think reignited for a lot of people the idea that direct action works, the idea that when you run up against political power, concerted political power and special interests that are standing against you, one of the ways around it is not just by building similar political power to compete and within the formal electoral system, but putting boots on the street, putting people on the ground in a way that calls out to the conscience of anybody who sees what they're doing. How do you see direct action working in what feels like an impasse right now on this issue?
Well, for direct action to work, first of all, it must be a moral fusion direct action. It can't just be something you do one day. It's got to be broad. It's got to be deep. It has to all people. But then you have to have that a legal strategy, and then you have to have a legislative strategy, and then you have to have a way of framing issues in a moral form that allows people to see their connections. And in the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and it was the Texas Poor People's Campaign that invited us to Texas. They said, look, in Texas, we got 13 million poor and low-wealth people in the state, 5 million people who don't make a living wage. In Texas, it requires 101 hours of work a week if you work $7.25 at a minimum wage. We have to find a way to bring all of those people together and help them understand that the same forces that promote systemic racism and push poverty and ecological devastation, denial of health care and the war economy and the false moral narrative, religious nationalists are the same people. And if they are cynical enough to be together, we have to be smart enough to come together, and we have to stay there long enough. You know, Moral Monday in North Carolina went on for 3 years, plus we fought a court battle for 4 years. But we also have to say in this moment, states cannot do this by themselves. We have to have federal legislation. If we don't get this For the People's Act, then that means you are for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce over the United States Constitution. You want dark money over public money. You want to end same-day registration, early voting, and opportunity to vote. And what you want is a narrow opportunity for narrowing the opportunities for people to vote. And we can't do this state by state. We need federal legislation. We also can't have people saying, well, let's just get the Voting Rights Act. No, that protects you after the fact or in pre-clearance before the fact. In order to deal with what's happening right now, we have to have the For the People's Act. But when you mobilize, Rachel, you have to connect the dots. And too often what happens is we get black people over here and white people over here and brown people over here and Latino people over here. And that silos are important sometimes. But in this moment, when we're talking about these kinds of attacks on our democracy, we have to have a coming together. And that's what you're going to see. In fact, on the stage on the 31st, the only people that are going to speak are poor and low-income, impacted people, moral leaders, and activists. That's who's going to be talking to the nation that day.
The Reverend Dr. William Barber, president of Repairers of the Breach and the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. Beto O'Rourke, former Democratic congressman from Texas, the founder of Powered by People. Gentlemen, thank you for helping us understand this tonight and talking us through it. I really appreciate you both taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Again, the march that they're announcing will be held July 27th through July 30th. It starts in Georgetown, Texas. It ends in Austin, Texas. They're describing it as a Selma to Montgomery-style march. It is a 27-mile march from Georgetown to Austin. They're going to do that over the course of those 4 days. And then the day after that, July 31st, a rally at the Austin State Capitol, all designed to nationalize the voting rights fight in Texas for federal voting backstop protections. We'll be right back.